What I'm going to do real quick, we're just trying to, just trust me, we're going to pull the pieces together little by little as we go through this. And so as we bring in some pieces, we're going to sort of show you how things fit. As we're doing this training, essentially we're trying to build a toolbox. And so we're giving you tools for the toolbox. And these are tools you can pull out and use. So we're trying to create sort of some common language and common tools. Most of them are in this manual that you have, but right now we want you to sort of pick up on some of the principles, and we work on that. But I'm just going to share real briefly about the 4 phases of movement. We've experienced this, actually 4 phases of movement in the U.S. We've experienced the 4 phases of movement. You can see it in the book of Acts. But phase 1, if we think about going to a people group that has no known believers, or there's nothing happening, we're going to go in, and if you're going to go to that group, what are you going to do first day if there's no known believers? Pray. Yes, that's how so what can you do? 5 things? Pray. And then after we pray, what are we going to do? Yeah, we're going to share the gospel. So we're going to maybe fast and pray. We're going to share the gospel. So we're going to start going out and we're going to start casting seed. Now, if nobody believes the next day and the next day and the next day, what are you going to do? Pray and cast seed, and pray and cast seed. That was literally our first 2 years on the mission field, is we just cast seed until then one day somebody believes. Now if they believe, what are we going to begin to do? Disciple them. We're going to start equipping them to become one of the key workers to reach their own people group. So they're going to start doing what? Casting seed. So they're going to cast seed, and then eventually there'll be another believer, and there'll be another believer. Now when I start having a group of believers, what are we going to form? A church. This is literally what's going to happen. So we're going to form a church. It's probably going to end up being in a home. That's what happened in the New Testament. Most of them were in the home. And we're going to start there. Now, what do we want that church to do? We want that church to become healthy, right? And so, yeah, nice picture up there. So this church, we want to help this church become healthy. We're going to raise up leaders. But then what do we want that church to do? Yeah, we're going to want them to go out and cast more seed and make disciples. And we begin to see a few disciples multiplying other disciples among the lost. We're going to start seeing a few disciples and churches planting churches that plant churches. And this is literally what happens in a place like India where there's no known believers. And so as we go to do this, they're starting to become... The tools aren't real clear sometimes. Man, what's the best way to do evangelism? What's the best way to make a disciple? What does a church look like in the Himalayas? What does a church look like in the Middle East? And so some of these things aren't real clear, but we're beginning to learn. So we start having a few believers, and we start having a few churches multiply. And again, there's not real clear handles. We haven't really learned, hey, what's the best way to share with somebody in the Himalayas? What's the best way to disciple? What's the best set of stories? Maybe there's no Bible. How do we do this? And so we begin seeing this. Now what happens in the second phase, we'll call this emerging movement. So phase 2. We begin to have some really clear tools. And so we have tools that are really beginning to help. The church is beginning to multiply other churches and multiply other disciples, because we're starting to have some men and women who are learning how to equip people. You know, as Kumar was talking about, the church becomes the equipping center. So these churches are learning to equip, and so there's lots of seed being scattered. There's people starting to come to faith. Now there's starting to emerge some patterns. There's patterns. Wow, this bait works better here. Wow, this is a good way to share the gospel. This is a good set of stories that works well in this context. this is what the church looks like. This is what worship looks like in this setting. They're using a dumyen versus a guitar or a keyboard. And so you begin to discover some clear patterns of what God is doing in this work. And the church is now beginning to multiply. We're starting to see, I'm just going to say, 6 streams of churches multiplying to the 4th generation. So these churches are coming out, planting churches that are planting churches, just as Kumar illustrated with the disciples. And later on, we'll see in the book of Acts, we're going to be able to trace churches in the book of Acts out multi-generationally. And so God's moving in an incredible way. The other thing that's happening here is all believers, not all, but most believers are sharing the gospel. Most believers are making disciples. Most believers essentially are baptizing. Most believers are training. They've embraced the priesthood of believers. They are taking responsibility for the Great Commission, and the leaders are giving away authority. They're giving away responsibility. Responsibility is like fertilizer. If we withhold it, there's no fertilizer. If we give it, there's fertilizer. And so we see as God's moving. Then, the next phase, now on this side is heavy. I don't know if heavy is the right word. There's an impetus to obey the Scriptures. And so they're really working on obeying. The priesthood of believers is really priest bod. The priesthood of believers. Put a dyslexic on the front of a whiteboard and you're in trouble. So I just write like a doctor. That's priesthood of believers. I before E. So priesthood of believers is very strong right now in this move of God. Very similar to what we see in the New Testament. Very similar to what we would have saw Sundell Stearns in 1772 when he died, 1771 when he died. We saw his believers take this move of God all the way from the Chesapeake Bay down to the Mississippi Delta, and they saw 1,000 plus new churches in that area, most of them meeting in homes. There was very clear patterns as we saw God move through Sundell Stearns in this stage right here from 1800 to 1825. Later on grows to 46,000 churches, and is where you sort of get the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, again, as this is, there's formalization starting to happen now. So, formalization of the movement. Now, what also begins to start happening here is you might start to have some buildings pop up. And you're starting to have some really good speakers. So these guys, they're very clear speakers. Over here you had really good trainers who were outside the church who are doing this. And now we're starting to see buildings emerge more and more. We're also still seeing churches multiply. We're still seeing disciples multiplying throughout this as the movement gets formal. But now we're starting to see more and more of these guys in the church who are really good speakers, really good at expository preaching, teaching, whatever it may be. And they're just being used, and there's just still, it's a mixture of both. You've got really good trainers equipping the body of Christ, and you have these emerging sort of a formalization of the church. And we're starting to see things solidify more as to what is a church, and these good communicators. We're seeing a both and. Seeing disciples multiply, seeing churches multiply. We're seeing churches are now beginning to see people come. You know, so if you look back, you look at the history of Sundell Stearns, there was men and women coming for miles to come and hear some of these guys speak and preach. But then they would go to these new places and they would plant churches. And so you're seeing a both and. Does that make sense? And so the tools are very clear now. The patterns are very clear as this is happening. And then we have what's called the institutionalization of a movement. And when I say that, don't hear that as a negative term. Sometimes we hear that and we think that's negative. It's a normal thing. It's very normal for things to institutionalize. So it's not a bad thing, but the institutionalization of a movement. And if we just carry Sundell Stearns out, you know, you're talking 46,000 plus churches and millions, 16 million baptized believers as this thing rolls out. But now we're having much more formalization of the buildings, the speaking. There's starting to emerge formalization of training and teaching somewhere in this midst, where we have seminaries, we have Bible schools. We even have guys arguing about the finer points of the fifth point of Calvinism. And you could have 5, 6 rock star seminary professors debating one of the finer points of predestination or whatever, and they could be debating these things up in this area. But again, the church is still growing. Now, though, most people are being invited to a church, and people are coming to Christ by hearing good preaching, by hearing the gospel. And that's how many of us in this room came to Christ. Praise God, that's a good thing. But the trainer is starting to disappear. There's not a whole lot of value. I wouldn't say value. We probably actually really needed him. But this guy's starting to disappear, where he was really key in here. Now we're having trainers, of course, of pastors and leaders. This is normal, okay? You can lay this over various parts of the world, and this is sort of what the phases of a movement looks like. Now here is what I want you to think about. Now we live in a society now, whether it's America, whether it's the Middle East, whether we're talking about India, where we've got people in the U.S., for instance, who are from what we would call a UUPG, an unengaged, unreached people group, who now live at your back door. They just live a little walk away. That can be anywhere in the world in globalization with cities. Then we have people now who maybe look like me, and their mom and dad have raised up the kids. Now, don't you talk to Johnny Christian. They're bigots. They're racists. And they've been raised that way their whole life. It makes sense when I think about somebody who was raised in a madrasa. A madrasa, they were taught the same things. You stay away from those guys. They're dangerous. Well, now, this is the world that all of us live in. So we live in a world where people, they didn't come out of this, but they came out of this. And they're all through cities all over the globe. And some of you are going to countries where that exists. Now, what were we trained to do here? What were we trained to do? Come to church. We're going to have this thing, come to church. It's a good thing people came to Christ that way. But that's what I was trained to do. I'd knock on doors and say, hey, come to church. And I'd invite. Well, 40 years ago, 99% of your friends, you would invite to the church, say in the U.S. context, and they would come to church. Well, that's not the way it is obviously in the Middle East. It's not the way it is in India. Now in the U.S., it's not that way anymore. They say 40%, 39% of your good friends would actually come to church. What's it mean the other 60% of your good friends won't do? They won't come to church. So what's our responsibility? Go to see them. Go make disciples of them. So now, we are sent here and here. That was me. I was sent to a place where there was no Bible. There was no patterns. I'd never planted a church. I never even planted a church in a home. Actually, when I was going with the organization I was going with, one of the requirements on the checklist was, have you won somebody to Christ in the past year? And I was like, no. Okay. So what did I do? I went out and I won somebody to Christ. Okay, check that off. Now I'm qualified to be a missionary to plant a church where there's never been a known existing believer. Yeah, there's a big word for that, but I won't say it. We say it in Booger Holler. It begins with B and ends in sort of an S. But, bull, you know? So, no, you know? So I don't even know how to share the gospel with somebody in this context. I don't even know how to make a disciple in this context. I don't even know how to plant a church. Listen, this is why it's so important for us. This is the context all of us live in, whether we like it or not. I didn't move the ball. You know, I don't know why 90% of people in Washington, D.C. are uninvited to church. I don't understand what's happening in LA. I don't understand what's happening in London. I don't understand what's going on in Hong Kong. But God still wants us to go. And we're going to have to be learners. And we're going to have to rediscover, what does it mean to make a disciple? What does it mean to share the gospel? So, what I want you to be thinking about, and I'm just going to give you a minute to discuss this around your table. As we're going, and we're coming out of this context, but we are now living in this context. We are sending to this context. We are doing short-term missions to this context. We are sending full-time workers to this context. What are the obstacles there? So I want you to discuss around your table briefly, what are the obstacles as we send and go here and live in a place and go to places where this isn't the way the world is anymore?